What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. So I just wanted to do a quick video about e-bike chargers, right? And their connectors that they use to plug in to the battery, right? So in this case, we have a charger and it has this XLR connector on it. That's what this thing is called, right? So inside of this XLR connector, you can see there are 3 pins. There's 1, 2, and 3. So one of those pins isn't used, as far as I know, and then the other 2 are going to be the positive and the negative. So what happens if we want to use this charger, but with a different battery that doesn't have this connector, right? Because I got this charger is for this battery, it plugs together just fine, but what happens if this battery doesn't work anymore, and it might start an electrical fire any day now, because it's a unit pack power battery, right? So what happens if we want to use a different battery? We're getting rid of this fire hazard, but I want to use this charger to charge a different battery, right? So this charger has the wrong connector. So I'm not going to get into whether or not it's safe to use this charger on another battery. That's a whole different topic of discussion, right? Whether this charger, the 4 amps charging current, whether this is safe to use with another battery, that's a whole different subject. But in this video, what I want to talk about is just changing this connector, right? Because it's an XLR connector. It's meant to go in here, but I'm not using this anymore. So I need this to be something else, right? I would like to change this to an XT60 connector. So how do we do that? How do we change this connector on my charger to a different one so that I can plug it into my new battery, right? So inside of this cable, there's going to be a couple wires that connect to the pins on this connector. And so some of these, they will unscrew, right? Like this particular one, I can unscrew like this. Some of these aren't going to be able to unscrew, and it's just going to be one solid molded piece of plastic, in which case you might just have to cut the wire right here. Just cut it, you know? But so this one I can just unscrew like this. All right, so then we can see that, okay, so we open this up a little bit more. There goes that piece. So now we can see we've got this here, right? So what do we got going on here? So there's 3, let's get this little, here we go. So there's 2 wires soldered on there. So let's chop this off. We're gonna need a wire cutters. Chop it off. Okay, so now I've got this. And so when you see a brown and a blue in these, usually the brown is the ground or the negative, and then the blue is the positive. Okay, so here you can see that I've taken the 4 screws off the side of this thing, and this thing kind of just opens up like this, and you can slide that panel off. So then right here, so there's our brown and our blue wire, and you can see in this one charger, if we follow this blue wire, it's going over to the negative. So it always pays to check. Otherwise, you're going to have to redo things. So do as I say, not as I do. Make sure you double check which color is which. What I want to do is I want to get an XT60 connector on the charger. And so I'm going to take one of these little cover guys, get that out and get that ready, and then I'm going to want to find a male XT60, that's this one, with the 2 little pins inside of it. So that's the male one right here. So that's what we're going to want on our charger, because the battery is going to have a female connector like this, that this one can plug into. Right, so we're going to use this male one for this, and basically you can see on here one side is positive, one side is negative, so that is going to go like this, up like that, and I'll show you how we do that now. First of all, I'm gonna get all of this stuff. Let me get this little thing off. And then get this cable here. Get all that off. Get off of there. Get off there. Alright, so now we got this. Right, and so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take my razor blade and I'm gonna make a cut right down the middle so we can separate these two wires a little bit more and have them out of this insulation. So I'm gonna cut this kind of right down the middle until we have enough room. Oh, and then rip it off. So now I've got something like this. All right, I've got some heat shrink things here. And we're gonna find one that fits these wires nicely. And then kind of get that started on there. All right, so now I've got this sheathing, or this heat shrink way back here. So it's out of the way, and that's gonna be the one of the last steps that we do to finish this off, is to bring this heat shrink back up here and shrink it all over everything. So just pull that heat shrink, pull that heat shrink way far away from where you're soldering so that the heat from soldering doesn't make it start to stick. And then the next thing is I'm going to get this little piece right here. So I usually put this piece here like this, right? Because we want the wires running through that before we solder these ends onto the connector. All right, so I've got this piece on there, and then I've got a couple pieces of heat shrink on here. So now we're ready to strip the insulation off the end of these wires. So I'm gonna get my wire strippers and do that. All right, so we stripped the wire off the end of these guys. So I'm gonna get my soldering iron. And I'm gonna tin the end of these wires just a little bit so that all the wire strands are kind of like held together. So I'm gonna get my soldering iron and just put a little bit of solder right on the end of these. All right, so you can see I tinned the end of these wires. There's a little bit of solder on there. All right guys, so now what I usually do before I solder these XT60 connectors is you wanna plug two of them together, because if they get too hot, these little metal things can start to melt out of the plastic and they'll move around. And so what you can do to help prevent them from getting too hot while you're soldering them is plug them together with the other, like I'm plugging the female and the male one together here. So plug them together. That helps handle the heat when you're soldering them, and then you just gotta remember which side you're working on. So I want the male side, so we're gonna be soldering it onto this end. So then I'm gonna tin this XT60 connector. I'm just gonna melt some solder into these cups where the wire goes to kind of get those tinned and ready for the wires. All right, so you can see I've put a little bit of solder down into the XT60 cups. So they're full of solder. And now I can connect these wires into the proper little cups on my XT60. So I'm gonna do that next. All right, so you can see I've soldered these wires onto the connector. The brown one is going on to the negative and the blue one's going on to the positive. Get this out of here. Oh, double check that right here. So blue, positive, brown one, negative. So now what we can do to finish this up is bring these pieces of heat shrink up. All right, so let's bring this heat shrink up over this. So we can bring that heat shrink up in there and kind of push it up in there, and do the same with this one right here. Get that going up in there. All right, and then we take, then we can take our heat gun and shrink these on there. And we can just slide this little piece up. Get this going on there. Sometimes you gotta kind of use the pliers and be careful so you don't mess anything up, but there we go. Now we can pull this one off. Ooh, now that we're done soldering. And then so the final step to complete this guy, you remember this piece of heat shrink that we had back from the beginning? We're gonna pull that up. We're gonna pull that up like this and then get that going on there. All right, so now I've got something that looks like this, and we can clean this up just a little bit more with an extra piece of heat shrink that can squeeze over this whole connector. So I'm gonna do that quick. All right, so I pulled a piece of heat shrink like this. All right, so that should do it. We've got our charger. We rewired it so that it's hooked up to an XT60. We made sure that the positive is going. Alright guys, so to close this video, I've rewired this charger up to this XT60. Alright, so I've got that working, looks good, feels good. I put a little piece of shrink wrap on the outside of it, and it kind of went over this inner piece of shrink wrap, so this feels really solid. This feels really good. However, one thing that I want to make sure that you're very careful of, because I made this mistake, is do not assume that the color of these wires that we wired into this XT60, don't assume that the color of those wires remains consistent across multiple chargers. I have a bunch of these chargers, and it's always been brown is the negative and blue is the positive. I've rewired probably a handful of these, and it's always been that way. But then for this one charger, for some reason, the polarity was reversed, and this one is actually, the brown was positive, and the blue was negative. And when I plugged it into my battery, this was wired up with reverse polarity, this charger. So I plugged the battery into the charger, and this was reverse polarity right here. And I'll put a picture on the screen of what happened, but the XT60 basically exploded, and I saw like a blue flame or something. So the problem, like when you do this, when you rewire this, I would make very sure, what you gotta do is this. You gotta open this charger and slide this thing out just a little bit and physically look at the wires that are coming out of this charge cable that's going to the battery. Okay, so here you can see that I've taken the 4 screws off the side of this thing, and this thing kind of just opens up like this, and you can slide that panel off. So then right here, so there's our brown and our blue wire, and you can see in this one charger, if we follow this blue wire, it's going over to the negative. And if we look at this brown wire, that is connecting over to here, then it goes through that fuse to this red wire right here. So brown wire, fuse, and then it's going to this red wire, and that red wire goes to the positive, right? So in this case, this one case, the brown wire was positive and the blue wire was negative. So you might want to, I would recommend that if you're going to rewire a charger, you want to open it up a little bit and look inside and make very sure that the color of your wires is going where you think it is. Most of the time, brown is going to be the negative, but in this case it wasn't, and it was backwards, and it caused some problems for me. So it always pays to check, otherwise you're going to have to redo things. So do as I say, not as I do. Make sure you double check which color is which, so that you don't have the same problem I did. Alright? But anyways, we got this back asswards thing all wired up. I was able to charge my battery. I got a nice XT90 anti-spark connector on little baby Samsung now, so that's great. And yeah, so that is how you rewire a charger to use a different plug, and just make sure that you're wiring it up correctly and it's not reverse polarity. And you can check inside the charger. Sometimes they'll have it marked on the case of the charger. Sometimes it'll show like an image of the XLR connector, and it'll show like pin 1 is positive and 2 is negative or whatever, but there was no marking on this one. I checked that, so I had to open this one up and look at the color of the wires and then follow where they connected on the circuit board to see which wire was what. And I think you could also use a multimeter on those wires to check the polarity of them as well. I just checked it like this. So yeah, that's how you can rewire your charger. Just make sure that you wire it up with the right polarity. Check those colors of the wires and make sure that there's nothing funny going on, alright? Because I blew something up earlier and it was crazy, so be careful. And thanks for watching. See you later. Bye-bye. Like and subscribe.